We're here today because we are raising awareness about how housing associations have lost their social purpose, we feel. So they've become highly commercialised, they're much more interested in developing homes for sale and for rent at full market rates. A lot of these housing associations actually started out or have continued taking properties from councils, which means that they've been built with public funding, and that's taxpayers' money that at the time taxpayers believed was going towards building homes that would be let out at low cost rents. But in actual fact, what's happened is that these have been turned into these huge businesses at the big end of the housing associations, these huge businesses that are there about making money. So they look at, how much money can we get out of leasehold, out of regeneration, out of the sort of shared ownership model, and really very little about actually providing properties at low cost rents that ordinary people can aspire to live in. People are being driven out of city centres. People, even in rural areas now, are really struggling to find homes. And this kind of obsession that these housing associations have just got no connection to those local communities anymore. They tend to shut down the local neighbourhood offices. They don't do the kind of outreach that they used to. And so they've really changed in character quite significantly, we think. And it's this kind of focus on commercialisation. It's this obsession with build, build, build without thinking about who is going to live in those homes, what the quality of those homes are like. A lot of the new build homes are just, absolutely falling to pieces within a year of being built. So they're not thinking about the quality of it. They're not thinking about who is going to live in those properties. And we really need to raise awareness of this because I think there is still a real lack of awareness. There is still a perception that housing associations are a force for good, and we now see them really as part of the problem. There are 3 lines of accountability. Each of them is problematic. One is, as an individual, you can go to court, which has lots of problems involved with it in the first place anyway, including, you'd have to fund your own solicitor or self-represent, which a lot of people would find really difficult. But the other kind of big issue around it is when these housing associations are kind of committing mass fraud, which they are with service charge abuse, for example, you cannot say that the answer is for each affected individual to have to go and bring a court case, wait 8 months, maybe 2 years to get a response to it, never get a refund, very low levels of court fines, things like that. So it's a very weak mechanism. And it also relies on every single individual kind of knowing that they've been defrauded and then actually seeking remedy for it. So it's a very unsatisfactory way of sort of dealing with it. The other way is the regulator of social housing, and since around 2010, government has just cut back and cut back and cut back on the powers that the regulator had. So again, they now are really narrowly focused on the financial health of the landlord and the governance of the landlord, really only insofar as it actually looks after the financial health. And they don't anyway kind of directly, in most of the work that they do, there are some exceptions, but the majority of their work that they do, they're not like a complaints organisation. You couldn't go with a complaint for them to investigate and then to give you a sort of remedy in your case. That's not how it works. They're looking at the overall health and governance of the organisation. And then the other avenue is the housing ombudsman. And again, although it's overworked, it's funded by the housing associations themselves. They're overworked, long waiting times to get your case taken up, a long waiting time to actually get it investigated because of the staffing levels. But then, their sort of compensation that gets awarded is like £200–300. Well, when you're looking at Clarion with 285 million surplus, you're not really going to be, that's not really going to be a deterrent in any way. So as the point you're making is around the accountability. That's not going to hold them to account, is it? Because it's not really having an impact on them. That's a business, a very small business expense to them. Do what we want to do. I mean, if you look at Clarion, to take Clarion as an example, they ran down the Eastfield estate for years and years and years. People were living in the most appalling conditions, trying to get people to do something about it, the staff at Clarion. And Clarion admitted in a kind of parliamentary inquiry that it had actually, deliberately run this down. It had sought an exemption from the regulator to be allowed to sort of, ignore the provisions of the Decent Home Standard. So they can get away with that kind of thing, with the sort of collaboration and approval of those who were supposed to be regulating them. And then we get a lot of complaints actually from councillors and MPs about how these landlords will just ignore them when they try and intervene. So, they don't even feel that they don't have to answer to anybody. And probably the only people who they do feel that they've got to answer for are the people in the city that give them the loans that they're building with. And that's really who they're focused on keeping happy. So I think that is a critical kind of gap that you've identified, a chasm really, that there is no accountability now that kind of breaks that sort of ability to influence how they behave. The sort of government label, when they register, is a private registered provider, so they are private. Some of them now are for-profit as well, so they were traditionally not-for-profit organisations. They accrued surplus rather than profit, which looks very much, from where we're sitting, looks very much the same. The only difference is really that it can't be paid out in dividends to shareholders, so shareholders wouldn't get dividends in the way you would with a floated company, a company floated on the stock exchange. That's the big difference. They say the money gets ploughed back into the organisation, but you have chief executives on $500,000, easy, $500,000. So, that's where it's being ploughed back in. It's certainly, and, as I said, this kind of obsession with building, that's where it's being ploughed back in. The tenants and residents have no say over how that money gets used, where it's needed, where it should be invested. So, that's just not happening. These are private organisations, and one of the most, one of the really bad things about that, I would say, is that it means that they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, for example. So there is no right in the way that you can with a council who is also a social landlord. You can use a Freedom of Information Act, you can use that to get information about what the council is doing. And again, that's part of the asymmetry. If you don't have the information, then how can you properly hold your landlord to account? There is no equivalent for housing associations. They get millions of pounds every year in funds from the taxpayer, either through grants or through housing benefit. I mean, staggering amounts of money, but there is no access to the Freedom of Information Act, which should accompany that big public investment, really. So yeah, them being kind of private providers. And also, what we would advocate is that, really all public housing should be the property of the local councils. And if you had that, not only would people have a level of democratic control, we know it's absolutely far from ideal, but the money that is paid to them would ultimately be going back into the public sector. The housing benefit that is being paid would go back into the public sector. At the moment, it's going into the hands of these private landlords, as you say. These are private landlords, and it's going out of the public sector. It's going into sort of private hands. And now what they're having to do is to rent temporary accommodation at astronomical levels, rates far higher even than normal rent levels, which we all know are very, very high, particularly in certain hotspots. That they're having to pay that to provide temporary accommodation, and some of them, they're saying up to half of their budget is being used just on temporary accommodation, and actually not housing that many people because it's so expensive.
And some of that is renting back what belonged to them in the first place.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. So and in some cases, councils are actually buying back the properties that were rented, that originally were built with their money, with council money. These properties were given away to councils. The councils are now, in some cases, selling them back to the housing associations, rather, are now selling them back to the councils, that originally built them, before handing them over. And it is this absolutely insane loop, and the people who profit out of it are these big private landlords. It's not us, the taxpayer, it's not tenants and residents, it's the big landlords and all of these subsidiary companies. And which bit of that couldn't you foresee? Which bit of this kind of crazy loop could you not foresee? It's very obvious that if you sell off all of your housing to private landlords, you've then got no control over what they do, and yet the councillors are now complaining because they've got no control. Well, couldn't you have foreseen that? You know, if you've got no housing, then people who need temporary accommodation, you know that's going to be a very expensive thing to have to rent. You know, couldn't you foresee that? You know, all of this was foreseen. None of this should have come as a surprise to anybody, but the councils are all acting kind of really surprised that actually they are, as you say, being forced to the edge of bankruptcy and into bankruptcy in some cases, purely by the decisions that they have made. You know, they were the architects of their own, you know, excuse the pun, but they were the architects of their own failures, really. And we need a rethink now by central government. We need central government to really get a grip on this. We didn't have much hope that the kind of dog days of the Tory government were going to do that. They were just trying to benefit their mates as much as possible, I think. But we really need to put pressure on this Labour government because their manifesto didn't suggest that there was going to be anything brilliant really done to significantly change the way things are.
Yeah.
The court system, it's very, very difficult to bring any kind of group legal action. It can be done, and there are some groups doing it, but it's quite expensive and it's quite difficult to do. Because it's not. I mean, the advantage, for example, that people who were fighting the post office had, you know, and theirs was a grueling campaign. I'm not suggesting they had an easy time of it or something, but the one advantage that they had was a single. They were targeting a single organisation. We've got, you know, at least 200 housing associations that have more than 1,000 properties. You know, so the sort of, you know, small to the big in that range. There is over 200 of them, so it's very, very difficult to bring people together and say there is a single thing that we can hang a legal action on. We are looking at some kind of strategic lawsuit, possibly against government, possibly, you know, I don't know, maybe against a particular landlord. We're investigating, we're at the research stage with a law firm at the moment, so we are looking at that, and we would get lots of support. So other kind of housing campaign groups would come in and support us if it looks like there is a legal hook that we can sort of hook it onto. But we're at a very early stage with that. Yeah. There is a staggeringly high level of landlordism and kind of financial interest in development companies and construction companies. Around a third, I think it's a third, yeah, around a third of all MPs get some income from being landlords, and that's just them directly, but, you know, so not counting maybe an interest amongst their wider family members or circle of friends. And it's 0.3% amongst the ordinary population that actually gets some kind of income from landlordism. So you can see this huge disparity already, can't you? You know, that their interests, and those are the people who are, you know, these are the MPs. If you're an MP, you can talk to the party in power, you can lobby so much more easily than we can from the outside. I doubt that there are that many MPs in our current crop of Parliament that actually grew up in social housing, that have any commitment to it. I'm not saying there are none, but certainly very, very small numbers. And the landlord lobby, if you like, is much better represented than the tenant and resident lobby. So yeah, we have to put pressure on. It can be done. You know, we have to recognise that it's quite a big struggle, but we also have to recognise we can do it. If there is enough pressure from below, we can do it. One of the trends that we see in the sector has been this trend to merger. So even the G15, so some of the most powerful landlords are now the G12, you know, because they've merged. And that merger, you know, the sort of setup, the structure, the infrastructure around the sector, so the regulator, the funding systems, things like that, are all push them in that direction. Because you are generally financially more robust if you are bigger and you have bigger income streams. And therefore it is always seen as a good thing for housing associations to merge. It's from their perspective. Actually, from the tenants and residents' perspective, they get promised greater efficiencies. They get promised, you know, that there's going to be, you know, they'll be able to get cheaper electricity deals, they'll be able to get cheaper insurance deals, you know, that they'll have these construction firms that will do, you know, cheaper kind of, you know, contracts. None of that is borne out by the facts. Time and time and time again, we see that actually The tenants and residents, again, they get the raw end of it. The organisation becomes more remote, it shuts down its neighbourhood offices, it hasn't got a local presence. It's very, very hard for people to engage and get things done and you know, get repairs done and things like that. Get antisocial behaviour sorted out, those kind of things. So you know, this kind of merger fever is definitely part of this commercialisation. And you know, reducing them, and as you say, tending towards a monopoly. But also the point we make in the Golden Web article that we wrote is the connections that they have between each other. It's actually a very small incestuous sector at the top. The executive of this housing association will be on the board of another housing association, will be doing consultancy for a third housing association. So, you know, they're very interconnected and all got each other's backs, all got each other's ears. You know, they're really kind of self-contained. They're in this little golden bubble, helping each other out. Riverside, because of the financial problems which Richard Hill oversaw, who actually used to work for the investment arm of the what is now the regulator, but you know, used to be the Housing Corporation. He worked for the investment arm. He then went and worked for, took over as chief executive of One Housing Group. Basically, ran it into the ground. It had then to be rescued. They never called it a rescue, but it was rescued by Riverside. Everyone knows it was rescued by Riverside. Even Riverside was anxious about taking it on because it was still quite a big housing association that could have gone belly up, you know, and brought down the whole of Riverside Group. So even they kind of kept it as a subsidiary for a long time rather than actually merging the two together properly. And they are now properly merged together. So, but we've seen this time and time again. You know, Guinness has taken on Shepherd's Bush Housing Association, and you know, and so we've seen these mergers time and time again, you know, taking place across the sector, and you know, that will continue, and people will continue hopping from one organisation to another. You know, there is, again, it's part of that lack of accountability. They do a job badly, they just go to another employer. So yeah, is that all right, Chris?
What's the Golden Web?
The Golden Web article is an article on our website, and it just plots some of the relationships at the top and between, you know, the Department for Levelling Up, the Ombudsman, the National Housing Federation, and how all the people kind of working in these organisations came from other parts of the sector and have come together and sort of hop around in these jobs and have got connections inside and outside government, which is bound to happen in any sector, but it's really quite prevalent in this sector, and it's dangerous. It removes that independent scrutiny, we think. So yeah.